Hello everyone, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today's interview is going to explore attention and Adderall addiction and the deeper philosophical wondering of what attention is and why attention matters and how our attention has been technologically manipulated by social media and what that might mean for us as individuals, as a society, and as an entire civilization. And the interview is with Casey Schwartz, whom I'm going to introduce to you in a second. But first, I've written a little something to sort of kick off the show, a little overture to the episode, if you will. Adderall increases attention, or does it? The statement begs the question, what is attention? It's common for us to consider attention as something akin to focused concentration, where an increased focused concentration equates to increased attention. In that case, Adderall might warrant the description of increasing attention, aka correcting for an attention deficit by increasing what's missing. And in the so-called age of distraction, where our attentional reserves and capacities are perpetually siphoned into technologies designed to hijack our attention, it might be fair to logically conclude that we're all suffering from a deficit of attention, of focused concentration, and perhaps Adderall or drugs like it are the medicine we all need to regain power over our attentional landscape. Perhaps our world is such now that we're all in need of stimulants, just to cope with the breakneck expectations of keeping up with the onslaught of notifications, without falling into the rabbit holes each one opens us up to. Adderall, the medicine for the modern mind? I mean, in all honesty, I'm on a stimulant right now. Yet, what if attention isn't focused concentration? What if the swell of euphoria and capacity that arises with the pharmacological onset of Adderall is not the consequence of correcting with the right stuff inside of us that we are deficient in prior to its consumption? What if, perhaps, we are losing our attention when we are only in focused concentration or distraction, depending on the blood serum levels of amphetamine? What if that swell of euphoria and capacity and the inclination, even urge to keep returning to it is a compensational adaptation to an inadequacy cultivated by a sickly overstimulated society and not the return to a state we should rightfully be in, one that is in favor to our well-being and health? What about when Adderall use becomes Adderall addiction, as it often does? What do we lose in ourselves and our lives? What might we have lost already as a society where Adderall addiction is so widespread and, in many circumstances, not only normalized, but almost necessary to keep up with the daily grind of the technological and cultural landscape of our modern days? What, in all of this, is attention now? And why does it matter? So those are the questions that we have welcomed Casey Schwartz onto the show to explore. And she is the author of the book Attention, a Love Story, which is the sort of central crux of why her and I are having this conversation, and sort of the central vein upon which the topics of the conversation came into existence. So here's her bio. Casey Schwartz lives in New York City, where she grew up. A graduate of Brown University, she holds a master's degree in developmental neuroscience and psychoanalysis from University College London. While she was in graduate school, she found the subject of her first book, In the Minefields, released in 2015, a work of nonfiction about the culture clash between the old and the new ways of thinking about the mind and the brain. Her writing has appeared in New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, Newsweek, Departures in New York, among other publications. Her essay for the New York Times Magazine, Generation Adderall, was the jumping off point for the book I just mentioned, Attention, a Love Story, attempting to tackle the question of attention in an age of technological onslaught. In this interview, we talk about Casey's Adderall addiction, her story of her relationship with and through Adderall use and addiction, how social media technology influences our attention and behavior, internet reactivity and mob justice, psychedelics, of course, and their impact on attention, and the deeper philosophy of what attention is and why attention matters. That's this episode, and that's what we're going to explore with Casey Schwartz. So that's our interview for today. Big thanks to my patrons on Patreon who make this show possible. The people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking out, are people who give significantly, some of which for a long time. So thank you. Patreon is the way in which I am able to produce this show and give it away for free and have total independence in its content. Independence in the sense that I'm not beholden to a larger media organization or beholden to the profit interests of sponsors. It also means that I'm able to earn a full-time income while doing full-time work for this podcast, which I do. The podcast and the larger body of research that supports it is my full-time job, often more than full-time. And Patreon creates this amazing opportunity for me to create things that I care about that I think are adding value into the world, or at least, fingers crossed they are, but at least that's my intention. And other people are getting value from and earn a full-time living doing so. And thank you to patrons for helping enable that. And thanks to Patreon for existing. And if you can't help fund this show, if you are not in that place right now, that's cool. Don't worry about it. All good. Enjoy it. Appreciate it. But if you can, I would love for you to financially support the show by becoming my patron or by leaving a one-time PayPal or crypto donation. And I'm really only asking for about the cost of a cup of coffee once a month. Everything is something, and it all adds up into essentially a solid financial foundation upon which I can continue to invest myself fully into this work, for hopefully the benefit of more than just myself, more than just you, but to people we haven't met yet or people who even don't yet exist. So thank you very much for supporting the show if you are at a place right now where you're able to do so financially. And with that being said, three more things. One, the video is slightly out of sync with the audio. Turns out the internet is not always as reliable as we all ideally want it to be. Okay. 2, I look like a slob, and I'm very embarrassed about that. And actually this interview and seeing the video afterwards, when I thought my hair was okay, was one of the contributing factors as to why I don't really have that much hair anymore. And 3, I talk a lot more than I normally do in this one, and that leads me to feeling a bit embarrassed as well, because I'd like to make sure the guest gets their full opportunity to speak. And it wasn't certainly me overbearing the whole conversation, but it was more than normal, and I have feelings about that. But I think the conversation itself, the interview, is still positive, and you'll enjoy it. So those 3 pieces of context. Oh yes, and the 4th, this was recorded in early March of 2021. So think back to what was happening in early March of 2021, socially, culturally. That's the context in which this conversation was happening. That's it. So thank you and enjoy this episode of Adventures to the Mind, episode 149, an interview with Casey Schwartz.
So James, what's your story?
What's my story?
Yeah.
In what sense? I mean, like, a story
What
is...
do you do?
Oh, okay. Well, I run this podcast, and
Nice.
I have written books. I think I'm writing another one. I'd like to say I write books, but I have yet to achieve another book. So I'm not sure if I am a writer of books or if I am having been a writer of books. We'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with the idea of having been?
No. Well, yes.
Then I'm sure you'll write another.
Well, there you go. Fair enough. I guess I could be if circumstance or unavoidable reality, demands that I come to accept what I least desire to accept about myself, which seems to be a hallmark in some way or another that I'll have and will approach at different times in my life.
Yeah. Interesting. The pandemic has made us, I think, all question what if that final rug gets pulled out from under us, right? Anyway, I mean, okay, I think we're in it. So the hell with whatever I had planned. We're here now. No, let's go with what you had planned.
Well, we'll see. Maybe it turns out that, the ambiguous path
the ambiguous trailhead leads to the very path we intended to find. But yeah, I mean, thinking about the pandemic and about stress and about how total stress seems to make focusing on any one particular thing and any that isn't the object of stress, that requires any type of like non-cortisol driven sort of nuance of attention is extremely difficult. And I think I have historically felt as though that's because I have attention deficit disorder, and I might, I according to the doctors, I do. But it also might be the fact that, well, I can't seem to use my attention properly because of this context in which I'm trying to focus my attention on this particular thing. And so I need drugs to assist it. And I have, not Adderall, because it makes it so that I don't sleep, period, and can't get erections. And personally, those are two things that I like having as a part of my life. But Vyvanse. So this is maybe the roundabout way of getting into exactly what we're here for, which is your book, Attention, a Love Story. And it sort of positions itself as an exploration that jumps off from a decade of what you describe as Adderall addiction. So I guess my question starts with something along the lines of, what was your Adderall addiction all about, essentially?
Yeah. And I do want to get back at some point to ask you about Vyvanse. But basically, I got to college in the year 2000 and Adderall was new. It had only been on the market for 4 years. I barely knew what it was. I barely knew what ADD was. I went to a friend, an old friend I had grown up with, was on campus too at the same college. And I said to her, I'm so screwed. I have an essay due tomorrow. I haven't even read the book that it's supposed to be about. And she said, try an Adderall. I can't stand them. It makes me want to do cartwheels down the hall all night. Okay, so that for her was a disadvantage. But for me, that's when the seduction began. Because I love being up. And I can still see that blue pill emerging from this gross like ball of tinfoil she kept it in. And I took this Adderall and it was sort of the proverbial key in the lock, because I was up all night just riveted to this book. And I don't even remember. It's sort of typical of Adderall that I don't even remember which book. You know what I mean? But I remember the swell of pleasure that was now associated with deep concentration. And I read that book, I wrote that paper, and I thought to myself, oh, so this is what I've been missing. And over the course of college, I would just, whenever it was remotely possible to get an Adderall, I got an Adderall. And that became easier and easier. And then I think, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that Adderall is not difficult to obtain with or without a prescription. And that was true even then. And basically, by the time I was a senior, I was in its thrall so entirely. I was so convinced that I do not have the natural capacity to sit and comprehend complicated texts or write creatively or do all of these things that I so value doing without this drug. Even though my schoolwork was becoming harder and harder, my grades were dropping, and got to the point my senior year, I had to take all these incompletes. I've never done that before or since in any way. Because I sort of fetishize hitting deadlines, And I just remember I was sitting in the library. It was senior year. It was winter break, the beginning of winter break. I was still on campus. I was trying to finish this Russian history paper. And it would just been an insanely Adderall heavy week. And I wound up having a panic attack and going to the emergency room, convinced I was dying, which is apparently not that uncommon on amphetamines. And James, even that episode did not stop me from then dedicating the next almost entire decade of my life to this drug.
So I don't have the quote with me because apparently I didn't think until right now to include it. But near the end of this sort of, I think it's your first chapter where you really flush out the journey that you took in your. Sorry, there's like a clicking going on in your background. Do you know what that is?
Oh, sorry, no, it's the radiator.
Ah, okay. So, unavoidable then.
Let me, James, hold on. Let me see if I turn it off, if it will shut up. The problem is I live in an old building, a very old building.
Sure. Comes with its benefits and its drawbacks.
It does.
Cool. Can I get you back center of frame?
Oh, sure.
Awesome. Thank you. That's probably going to get cut out. We'll see.
Sure.
So, near the end of your first chapter, you have this beautiful line that I am either going to paraphrase nicely or butcher. Please forgive me. If it's the latter, which is something along the lines of, you come out of 10 years on Adderall and you're looking around at the world and you're wondering if the state of the world now and the expectations put on attention simply to survive within it kind of makes everybody basically everybody in a situation where they're ready for the Adderall cure. And I'm going to read this off my screen here. I'm going to try to balance the reading and the natural rapport.
Sure.
You present the premise that Adderall addiction is rooted in its ability to force our attention to work in ways that serve the expectation of the modern world. So those two, that reference to your book and the statement that you make, or incline, basically, what do you mean by this? And how do you feel like it showed up in you? And how do you feel you came to understand how it was showing up in the culture?
I've always thought it was interesting that Adderall and the internet have basically followed the exact same trajectory. They both, in some ways, were born in 1996, although, more primitive incarnations had existed of both of them before, but they both hit the market in a big way that year and skyrocketed in terms of their place in American life over the next 2 decades. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that we have been inundated with information. We're overwhelmed. We now have had to relearn how to train our attention, how to skip from one thing to another. And Adderall feels like the perfect drug for that. It feels like attention in a bottle, attention on demand, attention in an economy where what we're low on is attention. I think that's an illusion. And I think a lot of people fall down the rabbit hole of that promise. But I do think that Adderall and drugs like Adderall are like uniquely suited, promise to be uniquely suited in some ways for this moment of information overload that we're in.
So there's, save for specifically how you notice that coming up in you, but I don't think that's necessary. People could read your book and get that full flesh out because you tell your story very well. I'm feeling 2 lines of inquiry sort of like parting, and I think they're both ones that we should explore, one of which being the technology, and not just internet makes it like this, but specifically the technology that is designed to, as Tristan Harrison, when you talk extensively about in the chapters dedicated to technology in your book, says that it is designed to overtake our weaknesses. It's designed to outsmart our weakest parts and dominate our attention, right? So there's that line, because it's not just the internet, it's how the internet is being set up specifically to scatter us and harvest our attention, hijack it, that's the word.
Yes.
Hijack our attention. And then there's the other line of inquiry, which is what you suggested there, that it's an illusion that Adderall gives you more attention. And I'm thinking about something that you said in another interview, which is something like that your taking of Adderall had damaged or was inhibiting your ability to actually pay attention, and that it took you away from being able to access your full attention, and that what you got on Adderall was actually really far away from attention. So those are 2
of what attention actually is. So those are two lines of inquiry. Either way, I want to talk about both of them. Which one do you feel most excited to jump on first?
I think the second.
Okay.
I think the second, James. And I think one thing, I often think about even now, even though I've been off Adderall almost as long as I was on it, is how distorted my inner life became when I was taking it. And I never knew actually, I would, and I think a lot of people can testify to this, which is that when you're taking amphetamines, you're often in this place of like urgency. But then you think to yourself, well, am I really feeling that urgent, or is that just the chemical talking? And so often you have to second guess what is true, what emotion is true, right? Because you're introducing this like foreign body into your psyche. So I ended up thinking as a writer, right, which is like you're so dependent on knowing how you feel when you're a writer, I think, and if you actually don't know where those emotions are real or whether they're a product of the pills you're swallowing, I think you sort of lose your compass in terms of sitting down to do your work. Does that make sense?
Well,
you don't know how you totally feel about the world,
Yeah.
And that's such a component of attention, because like you don't know where your attention naturally falls when you are forcing yourself and your brain to pay this certain kind of amphetamine, like single-minded, nose to the grindstone kind of attention.
So
there's nothing expansive about that kind of attention.
Right. And I've heard you describe it as missing the forest because you were just so focused on one particular tree or one aspect of one particular tree kind of thing.
Right. Not even a tree,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, of course, there's a jump over, a tangenting bridge over to technology, because it's like, do we really know what our natural attention is if our attentional patterns and thus the manner by which we attend to life is being distorted by the embedded attentional patterns and behavioral attentional patterns that the devices force us into, or like trick us or hijack us into? Is the natural attention, is the attention that surrounds that behavior natural attention? Is Adderall a solution to that? Maybe you're suggesting that it might be, but in this weird two negatives don't actually make a positive situation. But I still want to avoid that for just a little bit longer, because what you had said there about connecting in with your feelings when writing makes me think of Stephen Herod Buhner and his ensouling language, and how, a good writer needs to have access to the feeling sense, that they need to be able to, like, whatever it is that they're writing about, they need to be able to reach out with that feeling sense and touch the world. And in touching it through feeling, access the meaning of the thing. And then through writing, put that meaning in the words, and then reach out with their feeling sense to touch the word and access the meaning there. And do this, is the same meaning called forth as the meaning that I'm touching in the world, which I often, when I take Vyvanse or something or write, I often be like, oh, damn, this is the shit. I'm like, in it. And then after 3 or 4 hours, I realize I don't think anything I wrote has anything to do with what I'm writing. I don't think anything I wrote has anything to do with it. And then when I read it back afterwards, it sounds really smart, but it feels like it's missing, not always, but it feels like it's missing something. And so my question then, and please feel free to comment if you want, but I have a direct question.
Oh, okay. Tell me the direct question.
If attention isn't this focused concentration, then what is it?
I mean, the best metaphor, I think, and James, and I then want to go back to what you said for a second ago about natural attention, because I question natural attention. But I think that the best way to think about attention is as a spotlight or a searchlight, which is one of the most common metaphors you hear in the attention research now, which is sort of like in the great blur of life all around us. What do you throw your spotlight onto? What do you throw your searchlight onto? And you do have to be selective. and it is limited. And you can't take in the whole environment. But that's kind of what I think about when I think about attention, is like throwing my searchlight on one particular thing of my choosing. But I mean, if you're asking from like a cognitive neuroscience point of view, I guess, it's what they, it's various brain lobes working in harmony. It's not just one part of your brain. It's many. But, to go back for a sec to what you said about natural attention, I don't know what natural attention means. I don't know if there is a natural attention. I think the whole thing is that our attention keeps getting reframed and reinvented and reshaped, right? And I mean, Nicholas Carr in his book In the Shallows makes this point that when books were sort of invented and more universally available, it required such an unnatural forcing of human attention into a form that had never existed before. It was almost as wrenching as when, people were required during industrialization to work in factories and be vigilant for 8 hours a day on an assembly line, that books themselves forced an unnatural attention. And I think, just centuries and centuries, human attention has had to sort of change form so many different times. So I think there's this almost idealized notion of a natural attention. But I would be hard pressed to define what it was.
So, I mean, I wonder then, something along the lines of, evolution meanders. Evolution is not the arrow of ascent, that each evolutionary change in a species or an ecosystem isn't necessarily to its greater betterment. I'd say that perhaps learning how to read and write books was to our benefit. And I mean, maybe the time window, the scope is a little too narrow right now. But given what we know of how social media technologies, and particularly the way that algorithms are formed to hijack attention and traffic in outrage, and how that changes people's behaviors, I like to characterize it as making people stupid reactive children, and thinking that that's them being, like politically conscious or sort of like aware of the news or in the loop or whatever it is, when actually they're just arguing like children. And by like children, I mean
totally.
like without the capacity to temper one's immediate reactivity so as to deepen an investigation into where that other person is actually coming from, which doesn't exist generally, or is extremely difficult to achieve in social media. And so perhaps it is not natural attention that is being perturbed by this, but the direction it might be taking us as a species, at least so far as what we see now, does not appear to be in service to whatever the greater human potential might be as a species, and of course as a species interconnected with a planetary organism.
No, I totally agree, James. And I'm so to the extent that like often, I mean, I'm so allergic to Twitter in particular. And often when I do look at Twitter, I'll honestly, it will sort of ruin my day because of that exact pattern you just alluded to of first the sort of the leaping to dismissiveness, the leaping to judgment, and the lack of a benefit of the doubt. There's a lack of generosity, which of course some people think of attention as being the purest form of generosity. There's a lack of attention to where is the other coming from. It's more like on Twitter, you just want to be able to instantly categorize and instantly dismiss. And that truly depresses me.
Mm. Well, you explore quite deeply in your book how, you became peripherally and in some sense directly, harmed by your father becoming an accidental casualty of the Me Too movement, and how much that sort of how much that damaged him and how much that damaged you at the time. And it seems like something like that continues to perpetuate itself. And of course it existed at different times. We did burn people at the stake at one point, like that type of bonding by bullying, shunning another person so that their side cannot be shared, and then sentencing them based on A, not having full information, and B, feeling like you're in the right because everyone agrees with you, even though what they're doing might be unethical. That has happened all throughout history, but happens very immediately in a social media landscape, and continues to, as I've seen happen even in my own sort of like pocket of culture, the psychedelic culture in there, watch similar behaviors unfold. And, people who are intellectually brilliant with PhDs, but seemingly, emotionally adolescent with social coercion technologies and the willingness to destroy without the maturity to do so in a deeply sort of nuanced way. And, that became a diatribe, not a question. So maybe now, as you could comment on this accidental casualty of the Me Too movement of your father, if you like.
Sure.
And then I'd love to start getting into what's wrong with the technology in particular.
Sure. My dad, whose name is Jonathan Schwartz, was he played the American Songbook for years on WNYC, which is the New York affiliate of NPR. And in 2017, I think it was, he was Me Too'd, except he never found out what he did, and we don't know to this day. So I was in the middle of writing this book already. Attention was already my obsession. And we lived through this experience as a family, and I never expected to write about Me Too in my book about attention. But watching it unfold from within, watching rumors indict my dad on Twitter within an hour, I suddenly felt, I couldn't help but see it through the prism of attention and the way that information can kind of take on a life of its own online, in the way that you were just describing, James. And of course, like as a woman, it was such a paradox because I was so in support of the goals of Me Too. But I felt like watching them play out in a way where the accused didn't know what he was accused of, so he couldn't even defend himself or take responsibility or apologize or anything. I don't know. I felt so compelled to write about it, and to this day I don't know if it was the right decision or not, because it's such a fraught topic, and I didn't want to be a spokesperson on this issue. And I wanted to write a book about attention, not a book about Me Too. But I don't know, I couldn't help but think I want to try to convey what it's like when you're dealing with the way that a situation is represented online rather than the situation itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I there's something, what everything I'm about to say is couched in like a support of what the Me Too movement represents for where we should be going as a culture, from a standpoint of like essentially respecting women's bodies, eliminating misogyny, like all of these things, and reducing the harm of sexual abuse and violence and all these things being couched in that. It seems, oh damn it, what was I even going to say? Speaking of attention, oh shit, oh, it's gone.
Oh no, I try to get it back because I'm interested.
What was the last thing you were saying?
Me Too.
No, before that, what was the last sort of statement you were making?
Just how it wound up being about how the information was represented online rather than what had actually happened.
Yes. Okay. So, and maybe this goes into
I mean, attention isn't a clearly defined thing, perhaps, as a thing. And so we're just like circling around it and sort of getting a sense of its shape by getting a sense of the negative space that it's occupying. But there's a reason why, for all the understandable fraught elements of the judicial system, that we have built a system of law and to keep keep decisions on sort of damage done and retribution needed, the system of responding to crime or whatever it is, impartial, because people generally, when they get activated and they get stressed, they're no longer really thinking in a way that is nuanced and sensitive, and it's easy to sort of like catch like a wildfire and then end up people just, like I said, bonding through bullying and all sort of getting charged on each other in a way where now it's no longer actually about justice, it's about vengeance. And it's about vengeance for things that aren't actually about what that person did, because now they're loaded by the call to vengeance as a consequence of what those people are holding internally, right? And that can serve a purpose, and sometimes because, for example, like Harvey Weinstein wouldn't have been taken down if it wasn't for the Me Too movement, because the legal system was ultimately in his favor because he had lots of money, right? But then in other ways, it can really catch out of control, and people who don't necessarily deserve to have their entire lives destroyed get their lives destroyed because of the distortions of attention that come from this tendency for us to move towards vengeance and pretend that it's us moving towards justice.
Yeah, I agree, James.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. And I wish that there was more of a conversation about, the nuances of this. Do you need to be permanently rendered sort of unhireable, rendered toxic? What was Al Franken accused of doing? What in some of these cases, you just ask yourself, who decided that doing X means that you're permanently banished? I don't know. I just feel like there's not enough conversation about redemption.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the capacity for a redemptive element in a person's life or even in society seems to be replaced by the necessity of extreme retribution, wherein it doesn't matter if the retribution led by the need for vengeance, and it doesn't matter if that retribution is paying back an actual crime, or if it's attempting to pay back a void in the person or in the people who are attempting to fill that void with that vengeance. And fair enough, there's a lot of people who are understandably very angry about a lot of things that I personally feel we should be quite angry about. And so these things, it's complex. These things are existing simultaneously. And I absolutely have no idea what the difference is. I like to think that as it's all unfolding, hopefully we're learning a lesson about what it means to go too far and what it means to think more complexly. I'm not convinced, but hopefully these are like missteps along a trajectory to something better, that this is the trajectory towards the better society we're all kind of hoping for, and the people angrily tweeting and canceling people are, in their mind think that they're moving towards. And I mean,
that'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, because you said that you've seen this sort of dynamic playing out in the psychedelic world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, give me an example.
Well, here's interesting. Okay, so at one point in your book, you say, at the time, you didn't want to say or write anything about it because you were afraid if you did, you would now become, as one of the sort of, I don't know if you watch Contraband, her YouTube channel. She's an incredible transgender YouTuber. And she holds this whole thing, like the tropes of the cancel culture tropes, and one of which is, I can't even remember them now, but one of which is like that you get
everything gets canceled down into something or diluted down into something in particular, which is like, somebody might have done this. Somebody probably, like, I think her example was James Charles. James Charles might have acted sexually inappropriately. James Charles was sexually inappropriate. James Charles was a sexual predator. James Charles is a sexual predator. Now it's James Charles is canceled because James Charles is a sexual predator, when the initial premise was James Charles is being sort of, there's a suggestion that he acted sexually inappropriately. But the reaction is to he is a sexual predator, right? So that whole outline in her thing is amazing. But anyways, there's all these tropes, and one of the tropes is that it's inheritable, which is that if I choose to align myself with or defend or not toe the party line on who's being canceled, then by default, I am worthy of canceling. Right? I am basically part of the problem, which is, again, I think it's childish thinking, but so because of that, you are reluctant to write about it. And so because of it, I'm reluctant to speak about it, because the things that are happening to me are about things that are really important and things that should be talked about, but they're happening in a way that would be sad if it wasn't terrifying. Yeah.
Right. And so how do you see it in the psychedelic sphere?
With a very particular ongoing incident that I'm reluctant to comment upon, because I recognize how this particular organization has been responding. And although I'm not against that organization, I'm concerned that any discussion of their response being whatever is going to get me characterized as an alt-right person who is supporting blah, 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 rather than somebody with commentary on what is ultimately unjournalistic tabloid behavior. Yeah. Which I've just outed myself to anyone paying attention to the situation, but that is what it is.
Of course, I'm sorry, there's all this light on my face. Yeah. I have no idea what you're referring to. So I'm curious, and maybe you'll tell me after we stop recording.
Yes, I can tell you after we stop recording. Let's talk about technology. About what you have a whole chapter about the problems that modern technology brings on board. And I even, I got the name for this was something like Adderall and Attention in the Age of Technological Onslaught. So can you comment a little bit, we've talked around it, but about sort of what it is that you learned about the technology that seems to be so problematic for our capacity to, say, wield our attention intentionally?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of nailed it earlier, James, yourself. But it's about the fact that these technologies are not neutral. They are like designed to suck us in, right? I mean, we all know this at this point. I feel like it's such a cliche to even, it's almost such a cliche to even talk about it. We're living it. We all know that, your brain itches to check Twitter, email, whatever it is, that there's, by design, we have been sucked in to these things. And that there's a pleasure in being distracted. That's the other problem. There's this sort of pleasure, this novelty seeking aspect of the way that our brains work, where we want to know, hey, who needs me? Who has a compliment for me? And let me open my email and see if, my agent wrote to me. And like, just that it's endless and perpetual. And I don't know about you. I mean, I'm 30. How old am I? I'm 38. So I remember pre-internet life when I was reading a book and my brain didn't literally itch for distraction every page. That's new. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of the chapter. And, Tristan, who you talked about a little bit, who I met when I was reporting this book, has been really important in terms of being the person who, he's an ex-Google guy who kind of blew the whistle and said, why are we not just not sort of trying to do better in terms of our users' precious attention. But like, why are we sort of being so sort of cutthroat in seeking to hijack it? You know, he's the one who I think brought a lot of this to the surface. And so I did want to include his voice in this book, because I think he did play an important role in sort of waking people up to it, even though for a lot of people it was pretty self-evident.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so something else that I'm thinking about here is I've been writing about okay, so
let me move out of this then.
As if I have not already occupied enough of our time here. Story time. I had no idea anything about your book until I accidentally was stumbling through Spotify and saw something called Attentional Love Story. And I was like, oh, that sounds good. I'll save that to my listen later, whatever. Some random amount of time later, I'm looking for something else, bored with what was available to me. And I was like, oh yeah, that thing. And I listened to it. I was like, this is great. I'm going to read this book. Got the book. But up until that point, I was writing about attention myself, wondering about it. And one of the things that I was thinking about was how what we attend to has certain expectations of how we attend to it in order for us to comprehend that thing. And our brain, our entire nervous system, including the functioning of our cognition and attentional behaviors, work towards habituating certain things so they run automatically for efficiency. And so we're likely, energy moves in the easiest direction. So whatever is most developed is going to be the thing that we're most likely to do. So if in a context where the technology, which is already very easy, it's designed to be really easy and really, like you said, euphoric, to just get lost in it. If that's already easy and we're falling into it repeatedly, then the manner of attention that this technology patterns into us as our baseline manner of attention, how does that impact then the meaning landscape of our lives? Because what we put the spotlight on is what is reflecting back to us about the world that we're in, and thus who we are as a consequence of responding to it. So I'm thinking about these things that come up into your book, and then you're exploring things where there were people asking questions about attention that were closer to what I just said than are the phones hurting our ability to read a book.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you can explore for us a little bit what you learned about the sort of deeper, say, maybe philosophical wonderings about what attention is and why attention matters.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I do feel a little like it's not that inspiring to talk about technology and attention on that superficial level, because we all know about that, right? Just from our lived experience. But what did really, really move me about this subject were writers like David Foster Wallace, the novelist who committed suicide in 2006. There are a few writers in my book for whom attention was an absolute obsession. And I think, who knows, but I think from having read him that attention became even more and more important to Wallace as he got older. And attention wasn't just, getting your work done. Attention was an ethic. It was about how you treat other human beings. It was about how you transcend your circumstances. It was about the absolute biggest things, biggest aspects of how we live our life. And he talks about it in Infinite Jest. He talks about it in his famous commencement speech that he gave at Kenyon College, where he's talking to a bunch of college kids being like, look, you guys don't even know what it's going to be like after you graduate. You're going to have some dreary job. You're going to have to go to the grocery store when you finish work. You're going to be exhausted and cranky. You're going to be at this grocery store stuck online, dismissing, being contemptuous towards the people around you. But if you can look at them with attention, you can imagine an alternative that's full of imagination and compassion. So it is the philosophical obsession for him, for Simone Weil, the French mystic and philosopher who said attention is the purest form of generosity. And, you know, when you think about like what it is to give someone your full attention, you know what she's talking about. And for other writers and thinkers like that, like it's not just about, you know, getting through your day productively. It's really a question of where you put your attention is ultimately how you live your life. And that's what I like to try to think about when I am in some disgusting Instagram rabbit hole. That just, you know, this book is not sort of a prescription for how to put your devices down, but it's about trying to reflect on how precious and valuable and invaluable attention really is, so that we don't just thoughtlessly squander it.
So what, squander it in what sense? Like what do we lose? What is being lost? I think we lose
the feeling of, like, I think honestly what's being lost besides time is this feeling of intentionality. And that's what makes me the most uncomfortable about these technologies, is that I feel like, oh, there's no hope for me in terms of feeling like a free agent here. That's what I hate most about it, is like, I may as well sort of declare defeat now, because there's clearly no hope when it comes to whether or not I'm going to look at my iPhone. And I just feel like trying to reclaim some degree of agency when it comes to your own attention is so profound. And all the more so this year, now that our lives are so entirely on screen, I feel like it's all the more urgent to realize, like, your attention is your single most precious resource, you know?
Well, also, you know, mentioning the pandemic kind of cuts back to a couple other things, which is that, you know, when we're under a lot of stress, it's hard to attend to anything that isn't the thing that we're like stressed about, or the thing that distracts us from the thing that we're stressed about. And the deep, sort of, for lack of better terminology, the deep attention to the things that might bring fulfillment and meaning to your life are generally not the things that we're able to attend to when we're doing either of these things because of stress. And I mean, that's another reason why I don't want to comment on this event that I said earlier, because I literally just don't have the capacity to respond to whatever the backlash might be, and still do things that seem deeply meaningful. And maybe I lost track of what I was saying. Oh yes, because also, you know, in your book about attention, you were talking about how Twitter, you know, like the way the Twitter responded to your father's allegations, you know, but also, I can't remember if you spoke to it, but it was kind of written or underwritten about how much that happening and the stress that it put on you kind of damaged your ability to do anything that wasn't attending to exactly that, or defensive reaction to it. Sort of, yes, almost, again, taking your agency away from you. And so, which is interesting, because it is the ability to do that deep attentional stuff that gives our ability to access the resilience, that deeper life's meaning thing. And yet the very thing that would help us in all of this is the very thing that we're least able to access, because the things that we're most able to access, you know, like I just said. So I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say, like, oh, since the pandemic started, it's been really, really hard to read. And, you know, I haven't found that, but I totally understand, because I think reading requires this huge amount of inner serenity, you know, in a way, to sit there and let yourself be transported. And I think it's so understandable that right now that feels nearly impossible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Either because the pandemic is generally stressful, or because chances are, if you're living in a pandemic, which we all are, at some point, periodically, if not perpetually, there's some sort of crisis happening in you or peripheral to you, which demands a certain level of stress response to.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So what were you going to say?
So I have a specific thing I was just so in awe of in your book, and it might come up naturally, but I'm not going to speak to it unless necessary. And okay. We'll see if we're getting around to it, which is that part of your book is you end up connecting with Gabor Mate, right? And so speaking of total stress, distraction is euphoric, sort of dissociation from stress. His book, Scattered Minds, is a description of basically how ADHD is an adaptive response to childhood environmental stresses that logs itself essentially into the brain's circuitry and becomes maladaptive patterns of attention and behavior later in life, or something along those lines. Now, you explore this, and then you explore meeting Gabor, and of course, anyone who's paying attention to Gabor's work knows that he's also all about and into the role ayahuasca or other psychedelics can play in healing trauma. And so you have this trauma link to a disease of attention, or a disease of, so-called insufficient attention, or too much attention to the wrong things, or whatever it is. And then you have psychedelics. And you don't end up taking ayahuasca in the book. I don't know if you followed up on that. But I'm wondering, in all the things that you needed to investigate in yourself in order to even write this chapter, to come to terms with why you would be even in Peru, why you would even consider drinking ayahuasca, was there some correlation that you found between attention and what psychedelics do for the mind that isn't through Gabor Mate and trauma healing?
Definitely. And I mean, I wanted to, first of all, I'm fascinated by psychedelics and psychedelic science, and basically because the whole subtext of this movement is we're not living quite right? And I connect that a lot to this technology landscape we're in now. And I think that people are desperate to try to piece themselves back together and be more present. So they, as the expression goes, right? And to be able to sit with their own thoughts. I think that has so much to do with what attention is at base, is like, can you sit there? Can you tolerate your own inner world? And to me, instinctively, I felt like I want to include some reporting on this newly booming world of psychedelic researchers and psychedelic users. And that's kind of how I found myself in Central America with Gabor. Although, as you say, I wasn't able to take the ayahuasca because I hadn't managed to get off an antidepressant that had been prescribed to me to help me get off Adderall. So it's all connected in a kind of like cosmic sense. But when I was at this retreat, I did hear a voice as I was sitting in ceremony say to me, "Get off the antidepressants now." And I never took another one again.
Wow.
So I do think of that as like hugely productive. Even though I did not drink ayahuasca then.
Mm-hmm. But then, so I feel like there was a thread there that I'd like you to maybe follow a bit deeper, or got dropped or something, which is psychedelics and the sort of inference that we're not living quite right, and wondering about, I assume you haven't had a psychedelic experience, but having had quite a number of conversations with people there.
Oh, no, I have.
Okay.
I have.
So then what do you think it is about what psychedelics do or offer in the experience, attentionally or otherwise, that sort of gives us the capacity to attend to life differently afterwards?
What I don't know if I could generalize for everyone, but just for myself, I would say that I feel like I look at the world differently and almost more simply when I'm on a psychedelic. That a lot gets stripped away. Do you feel that, James?
Yes.
Lot of anxiety and just sort of self-loathing and all the things that are a bunch of interior noise and pain kind of fall away, and you're left in a much more simple place. And I'm not like a huge psychedelic person, I've just dabbled. And I mean, I have a 1-year-old, so I feel like, I haven't exactly done much of it this year.
Right. Speaking of attention requirements.
But, but it is so, it has a profound impact on my attention, in that it becomes so much less painful to be present. And I wish I had written more deeply about this in the book, because I feel like it's something I still want to understand better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I would say.
Does that click for you?
It does click to some degree, although I wouldn't say that for myself. Like, dropping out of things being stressful or painful is an immediate response for me. Sometimes it's the consequence of having to do quite a bit of difficult laboring, which is essentially learning to figure out a way to just let it all hurt for a while before I can get to that place where it's no longer there. I actually have to go through the process of putting it down. Sometimes, however,
that sounds good.
Sometimes, however, there's the relief of being like, okay, I'm ready to do the work. And then, well, the mushrooms, for example, step in and be like, it's cool, man. We got you on this one. We can just be in a different kind of place this time. Like, oh, thank God, or thank you, whatever it is. So
have you spent time with Gabor?
No, I've not spent time with Gabor. I've spent a lot of time with Gabor's work. I've done his compassionate inquiry training. I had about 4 minutes with Gabor once, like you've seen, although he didn't give me his full capacity. It was more just like, because the opportunity I had to do that, I was kind of afraid to do it in front of the whole public group, but I did. I have sat in front of him many times in an audience and whatever, but I haven't been with Gabor specifically. No.
Anyway,
I envied that opportunity that you had, because he would be a very interesting person, I think, to spend time with. Although I think at first he might seem callous until he actually starts talking to you, because he has sort of a grumbly way about him from a distance.
Yeah. No, I mean, his ideas about attention were so profound, and so I did feel so lucky to get to talk to him about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we didn't go there, but I'm going to ask you about it now, and possibly this connects. And I know that we're working on about an hour. I could save this question / not ask it if you don't have a couple extra minutes.
No, I do.
Okay. So you talked about how something about the psychedelics takes down the something that makes life really complex, and then life seems really simple, and there's a capacity to say, using my language, to sort of just like drop into deep attention onto a thing. In your book, you explore attention's place in prayer and attention's place in the life of the religious person. And by religious person, I mean like the deeply religious person. And you even talk about scientists who were considered sort of like taunted or teased because they went so deep in their attention to the area of study that they began to define something beloved and even divine about the object of their study, the insects or whatever it is, that they started to access something akin to what a theist might call God in their subject. And so they were sort of like ridiculed from high society because they had gone too far with their attention. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about A, what you learned there, and B, if there was anything in particular that came up for you around, and this is a sensitive question, but came up for you around your relationship with the larger isness of being and your own struggles with the attentional changes Adderall brought into your life.
Wow, that's a deep question, James. I was so struck because, I mentioned that I include, I think it was 4 or 5 writers on attention. And it was only towards the end of the book that I realized they all were fascinated by religion. And I mean, you wouldn't think of these people as religious people. You know, it was like Aldous Huxley and David Foster Wallace. And I mean, yes, you would think of Simone Weil that way, but I couldn't help but notice they had that thread in common. And I'm not sure how much more I'm going to say about this here. But I love that question. I'm so glad you brought it up. And it's a little bit hard to answer something so large on Skype in this format. But it's something I still think about.
Cool. Well, then I'll take that as an opportunity to redirect that question to the listener to reflect on it as well.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
thanks, James.
Thank you, Casey. And thank you for this conversation. Thank you for the incredible book that you wrote, Attention, a Love Story. Actually, you said you wanted to ask me about Vyvanse. Do we have time for that? Do you want to still ask me about Vyvanse?
Yeah. Does it feel differently to you than Adderall? Because I've never taken it.
Yeah. I mean, it feels differently because, I mean, pharmacologically, it's different. You know, it even feels notably different than just taking dexedrine or dextroamphetamine as like the IR instant thing, or even the XR, because of how the pharmacology of it, or the pharmacokinetics releases the dextroamphetamine into the brain. And so it feels a lot smoother. I still have a euphoric wave, but it kind of feels like I'm riding it for the day as long as the dose is right. Otherwise, I'm even more distracted all day long. I'm just stimulated. And it enables, something about it makes it so that there isn't giant peaks and troughs. And without the giant peaks and troughs, maybe it's not impacting my cardiovascular system the same, or maybe there's some interaction with nitric oxide that is not happening with Vyvanse because of the peaks and troughs. But I feel like when I take Adderall, it's just like full stim and then fall back, and then full stim and then fall back, you know, with the waves getting shorter over time. And then even when I get to the place of like, okay, now I'm resting, now I'm tired, now I'm done, there's like a cement floor that I land in, and there's no relaxation deeper than that cement floor. And that's why I think I don't sleep. The nitric oxide cardio thing might have to do with the inability to get an erection that I mentioned earlier, which thankfully is only on Adderall and not the rest of my life, because that would be unfortunate if that was the accidental consequence of taking a bunch of Adderall for a short amount of time. But yeah, I mean, to me, they feel different in that way, I guess. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So then back on my other track there, Attention, a Love Story. This is the name of your book. Beautiful book. Where can people get access to it so that they can read it?
Preferably on bookshop.org, which lets you order from any independent bookstore in the United States, but, you know, also on Amazon.
Great. And is there any other way that people can follow you? We kind of like tore a strip out of social media today, but possibly you have some accounts people could follow.
Sure. I mean, I'm on social media. I rarely tweet, but I'm on Twitter, my name on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram.
Great. All right. So that's it. Casey Schwartz, thank you so much for being on Adventures Through the Mind today.
Thank you so much, James.
And cut. Okay, thank you for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it, please share it with a friend. You can also support the show financially and enable it to continue its ability to be a free show for anyone and everyone to derive value from by voluntarily contributing to the financial responsibilities of the full-time work of producing it. You could do that. Patreon, PayPal, or cryptocurrency donations. Links to that are in the description to this episode. And until the next one, thanks and take care.